Howdy neighbor, how is your garden growing? Me in my garden? Well, I'm excited to talk you through plant ideas, seeds to be starting, pruning, maintenance tasks, and just generally get you inspired to get out in your garden for spring. So if you're looking for some inspiration and some motivation to get out in your garden this season, this is going to be the video for you. And as always, I'm going to be using my handy dandy Wild Floridian garden planner, which is full of tips and ideas and places for you to plan your spring garden. Let's first start with and make sure we're on the same page of what spring is, because I know when I've asked you guys when spring starts, winter starts, fall starts, summer starts, we get a lot of different answers. And so let's just be sure, when I'm talking about spring, I am talking about the technical definition, which goes from March 20th to June 19th this year. So that means that we are getting the rapid ramping up of the temperature plus what you may be considering as the beginning of summertime. So when it comes to spring and the temperature, I mean, I think everyone's gonna agree it's warm. It's not only just warm, it's gonna end up being hot by the end of this season. It's also the end of the drought season, which means while we're gonna get rain March, April, May, and into the beginning of June, in general, it's kind of gonna be very sporadic. You're gonna get a 1/4 inch here, 0.1 inches there, maybe you get an inch or two, and sometimes we'll get a little bit of a deluge, but in general, this is not the monsoon of the summertime. This is bits and bobs of rain. And at the same time, our water table is getting lower and lower and lower down in the ground. And if you're not familiar with what the water table is, basically as all this water hits Florida, it kind of goes through a bunch of different sand and old coral reefs and rocks and then goes down into our aquifers. And Florida has tons of aquifers, which many of our cities and counties pull from. And if you have a well, that's also what it's pulling for, is typically one of our aquifers. But the thing is that because we have been slowing down on rain since November, they have gotten really, really low, which means plants that have shorter roots are stressed out and they're reaching and reaching and reaching. Add the lack of water in the ground, in addition to the fact that the heat is up, our humidity is definitely gonna be going up, and the sun intensity is going up, and you're gonna start to see some plants be stressed. This is also the time of year when wildlife is awake, it's back, it's reproduced, there's many babies around, and we're also having the northern migration. Remember, birds, butterflies, lots of insects and wildlife move south for the winter time to us, and now they're all heading back north, or they're increasing drastically. So all of those things are what's happening here in Florida. But that doesn't mean you can't be growing anything. That doesn't mean that you can't have tons of abundance in your garden. It just means that we got to be aware of these things as we go and plan. So let's first talk about what could you be starting in the spring months. Now, when it comes to the spring months, oftentimes people are thinking about warm weather crops or even cool weather crops because of where you guys grew up. And don't worry, there's nothing wrong with this. I was born outside of Chicago. My parents are from Illinois. Most of my neighbors when I was growing up were from New York and all sorts of places that were much further north. And so typically a lot of people get really thrown off at this time of year because if you've never listened to any of my videos and tips, you're just doing the usual thing. And you're not wrong for doing that, but this is what also gets so many of you guys frustrated. But there's so much you can still actually be starting. So one, we're not starting any cool weather crops, so no lettuces, no broccolis. They're actually gonna be heading out at this time of year. We're gonna even be avoiding things like tomatoes and eggplants because, well, we started those during the winter time. But spring, there's still a lot of stuff to start. It's just not the things that a lot of people typically think of when they think of vegetable gardens, because these are staples of the South or staples of the tropics. Because our weather is hot, it's humid, it's intense, and lots of the classic vegetables don't like that. There's still a lot of stuff you could be growing. So if you want to start things by seeds, you're going to want to be considering growing things like hot weather crops. Now these are from typically the tropics. A bunch of them are in the hibiscus family. And if you're not familiar with hibiscuses, well, they're in everybody's garden. So you want to consider growing something from the hibiscus family like roselle, cranberry hibiscus, and okra. Now for those who aren't familiar, things like cranberry hibiscus has edible leaves. They have like a very lemony flavor. Things like roselle can actually be used as a cranberry substitute, which is great because if we start them at this time of year, early in the spring, we'll have them in time for making cranberry substitute jams for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then things like okra, well, a lot of you guys have heard of those and may have had them in like jambalayas or gumbos and kind of those classic southern dishes. In addition to these hibiscus type plants, you want to be considering growing things like loofahs. And yes, those are the loofahs that you use to scrub yourself, the natural ones, but they can also be used as squash alternatives through the summertime. Other things you might want to consider are yard long beans or Asian style beans. A lot of those come from places that are in like the southeast of Asia, and so they have very similar climates to us and therefore can handle our temperatures, our heat, our sun, and actually do way better at this time of year. You can also consider doing things like Seminole pumpkins and Everglades tomatoes. Both are considered maybe native to Florida or native to the areas right around Florida, and they thrive at this time of year. And they actually can be a little bit slow to start when you do kind of classic tomato seed starting, because they actually want the temperature up. So consider doing some things like that, plus looking at things like your kind of more tropical peppers. Things like ají dulce are great ones to start by seed at this time of year. So at the beginning of the spring season, when it comes to starting plants, you definitely want to be picking up your seed packets. You want to be ordering them from online. And the thing is that when it comes to going to like the Home Depots, the Lowe's, the Targets, the Walmarts, typically the seeds you're going to find, maybe you'll find okra, but a lot of these other varieties I'm talking about, you're going to want to go and find a seed company that has more specialization in southern seeds. And the one I typically use to get a lot of the seeds that work really well here in Florida is Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. You can just go online, type that in, and you can get lots of these different varieties. Sometimes they'll have a little bit of a different name, but typically Everglades tomatoes, Seminole pumpkins, roselles, okras, all that kind of stuff you can find on there. So early in the season, get your seeds started. And if you're not familiar with how to actually get seeds started, you can go ahead and check out this video right here where I take you step by step through seed starting. And I know for a lot of beginners, that's super helpful, because while you've watched many people just do the seed thing, you may have those questions, those details that you need to talk through, and that video will help you with that. Now, when it comes to mid to late spring, you're really gonna be focused on these hot weather crops with moving them out into the garden. You've started your sweet potatoes, you've gotten your Seminole pumpkins going, but where, oh, where are you going to put them? And this is one of the challenging things about these hot weather crops, is that they tend to take up a lot of space. And not only do they tend to take up a lot of space, but they actually spend a lot of time getting ready to create their harvest, which can become a little bit tricky with timing, because here in Florida, right, we go from cold weather crops to warm weather crops. We do our hot weather crops starting in the spring that roll through summertime, but towards the end of summer and into early fall, we're going to be going back to warm weather crops, and we may need some of that space. So just something to think about is that you may want to create some dedicated spaces for your hot weather crops, or just be prepared to delay some of your crops later on in the season, just so that you can finish off your sweet potatoes, finish off those Seminole pumpkins, and finish off those long beans. And don't worry, you don't need to know exactly how many days that each crop's gonna take. That's one of the things I give you in the Wild Floridian Garden Planner, is how many days it takes until harvest. So that as you're laying out your game plan for the year, you kind of have an idea of when to expect your first harvest. So when it comes to those hot weather crops, remember, you're ordering your seeds, you're getting your seeds started, and you're preparing to transplant them for mid to late season. Let's talk warm weather crops and things we should be thinking about during the spring season. So in wintertime, you followed my tips and you actually got these seeded, or you bought transplants, and then you maybe have gotten them out in the garden. If not, you're getting them out in the garden early spring. So you're putting your tomatoes in, you're putting your eggplants, you're putting your peppers, you're putting your beans that are not the Asian long beans, but the other beans. Maybe you're putting peas in place. Those things are now in the ground, early season. So now what we're really focusing on in the spring season is, one, for many of these plants, if they have leaves that are within 6 inches of the ground, we're pruning those up and out of the way, because here in Florida, well, we have, remember I said the wildlife, it's coming back, it's reproducing a lot, and a lot of it really does want easy access to your crops. So by just, lifting the leaves off the ground, by cutting them away, you're gonna help, one, create a little bit of airflow, two, make it a little bit less easy to crawl up onto the plant, and three, consider going even a little bit higher, 6 inches, 9 inches, because you're gonna help the predators have access to those bugs too. Because here's one of the things I've learned throughout the years, is that when it comes to our wildlife, they can be a pain at times, but they also can be help. And you can help them by allowing them easy access to those little critters that are crawling up onto your warm weather crops. And some of the ones that are thinking about eating your tomatoes, your peppers, and your eggplants, because all of those are in the nightshade family, those are gonna tend to be hawk moths. Well, hawk moth caterpillars. Most people call them tomato hornworms or tobacco hornworms, but at the end of the day, all they are is hawk moth caterpillars. And you know who loves caterpillars? Birds. You know who else loves caterpillars? Wasps. You might not like wasps, but there are a ton of predatory wasps that are not those big yellow jackets. They are littler wasps, and they love feeding their babies, whether they're wasps or birds, caterpillars. So consider making sure there's some space for them to get access to these bugs so that they can feed their babies and you don't have to worry about caterpillars munching away at your tomato crop. Now, beyond just pruning your plants, the other thing that's going to be happening in spring with your warm weather crops is it's harvest time. It might not be that way at the very beginning of the season, but definitely by mid-season, your tomatoes, your peppers, your beans, your eggplants, they are starting to really produce. For me in my area, April, that's when it really starts to take off. So be prepared to be going out in your garden and looking for those first blushes, those big enough crops to be starting to pull in. And that's one of the things when you have kind of that, I'll call it like push and pull with wildlife, is the more that you leave stuff around that's ripe and ready to go, the more likely they're gonna take a bite out of it. So the more that you just stay on top clearing stuff out regularly, the better it's gonna be that you're gonna maximize your harvest. But one of the things that might slow you down is, one, you just get busy, but two is having a game plan once it hits your house, right? You pull some tomatoes, you pull some stuff, and then do you know what you're gonna do with it? Do you have recipes ready? Are you just gonna snack on it? Are you eating it fresh? Are you gonna freeze it? Are you gonna can it? So one of the things I wanna make sure that you're thinking about going into the spring season is what's your game plan for the crops that are coming in? I don't know about you, but me, once I start getting overwhelmed by harvest, and it doesn't take a lot, it can just be like a pound, all of a sudden you might have some of your harvest go bad and you might do some bad practices. You might do some things that might bring more wildlife in rather than maximizing your harvest for you. And one of the tips I have is that, you know what, if you have too much, share. Share with coworkers, share with friends, share with family, share with neighbors. No one's gonna ever be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're offering me free food. Lots of people will enjoy the idea of getting a little bit of extra harvest. And so consider staying on top of that harvest. Now let's talk cold weather crops and what you should be thinking about in spring with them. For your cold weather crops, your brassicas like broccolis, cabbages, kales, Brussels sprouts, early in the season is probably about when they're done. You're going to be having the beginnings of bolting when it comes to some of these crops if you haven't gone and harvested them. So just be prepared that especially brassicas early in the season are going to be close to done and are going to be shortly followed by lettuces. Because our temperature is getting hotter, because the sun intensity is really increasing, these plants are rapidly going to be in the temperatures and weather that they really don't like. And so they do their stress signal saying, I don't like this. And that's where bolting comes in. All that's really going to be doing is it means that the plant is throwing out flowers so that it can go to seed, so that it can die, and then the next round of crops can come back. But this can also be a win for you, because if you've really liked this crop, you want to let it go to seed and then grab the seeds so that you have them for when we come back around to cold weather crops later this year. So turn that frown upside down and just know that even if something's bolting, it's okay in the end. The other thing is when it's bolting, it is producing flowers. And you've heard me for months and months during my monthly garden guides remind you guys that you need flowers for bees to pollinate your tomatoes and your peppers and your eggplants and all those goodies. Well, the thing is flowers are flowers, whether they're native or they store-bought or they're on your broccoli plants. And yes, these beauties, these are broccolis. This is literally what they become. And bees actually enjoy them a lot. They can actually be really pretty. So one of the things you may want to consider as they bolt is just to leave them in place, harvest the seeds. Also, what they can do at this time of year is there are some cold weather crops that are going to go into mid-late spring season that need to be finished off. Things like your onions and your beets will actually continue to go, carrots too, into those early mid-spring months. And having a little bit of shade from these broccoli leaves can be great help. The other thing that these can do for you is that even if your broccoli floret is gone or your cauliflower floret is gone, you can still be harvesting leaves. Now, I will give you a warning that the more we heat up, even though this is bolting, this plant is stressed out. So you will typically see aphids start to come in early mid-spring. And if you have crops like kale, which can go into not only early mid-spring, but sometimes even the summertime, depending on your varieties, those aphids that are attracted to your broccoli will jump over and may make the leaves that you're still harvesting not as desirable. So one of the things to consider is just getting them out of the way if it's near a crop that's going to still be around. I'm pointing to my kale, it's behind this broccoli. But they could be levers of shade for other crops that are still finishing off, like beets. Now you may be wondering, but what do I do with the space that I have where these broccoli plants are. Now this could be one of the places that you would stick something like your hot weather crop, an okra or roselle or something like that. Depending on where you live in Florida and the timing and when you got your seed started for winter time, this could also be a place where you put some warm weather crops. Typically for me, what I do is I take out these broccoli plants and I flip them into banana peppers or cubanelle peppers, and they take about the same amount of spacing. If you remember in the planner, I do give you guys spacing, or you can always look this stuff up online. But I like to find crops that I can then like take out, put in, and then they kind of use up the same amount of space. So just consider putting in some things like peppers or eggplants in place of all these brassicas that got to head out early season. Now, depending on when you start with your cold weather crops, you might be a little sad that like you're having to clear them out already. But remember, at the end of the day, especially things like lettuce, if they haven't bolted yet, or even if they're just starting to look like they bolt, you getting them out of there at the end of the day is still a harvest. And similar to those warm weather crops, make sure you have recipes ready to go so that you have a game plan for all this final harvest. Because sometimes when we're preparing and clearing out the space, a lot more can come in than you expect, especially with these leafy greens because they have a lot of leaves, even when it's warm out. So I know at my final harvest, I'm gonna be clearing these out, passing lettuce to everybody in the neighborhood, my kids in the garden club, plus I'll be freezing a bunch of these leaves so that we can keep using them in smoothies, even though we're well beyond their season. But that brings me to something else with those warm weather crops. Earlier, I talked to you about getting your warm weather crops in the ground, and it may surprise you this final bit of advice that you need to prepare and plan for when it comes to spring and these crops is that most of your warm weather crops are going to be done at the end of the spring season. I know it really throws people because you're so used to hearing about tomatoes and peppers being in their prime in the summertime, those Julys, those Augusts, and that's what you see from a lot of gardeners up north. But in Florida, year after year, I've checked not only my own garden, but so many of you have commented that June, we're done. All the cold weather crops are gone, even those ones that last a little bit longer, like your carrots and onions, your tomatoes, and many of your peppers. Those are all going to be done and need to be taken out basically come June. You can let them just kind of die off and let the bugs come in, but oftentimes doing that means that you're going to have higher populations of those wildlife that we really don't want to have big populations of when we get ready to restart. And here's the thing, you shouldn't feel sad taking out tomatoes come June because it's only going to be like a month, 2 months, and we're restarting tomatoes, which is why we don't want to have a bunch of pests in the area ready to eat tomato plants, because we're going to have baby tomato plants 8 weeks later, 12 weeks later, not very far after. So plan for end of spring to clear out your beds and prep the area so that we can get restarted for the classic vegetable garden season to start all over again. And the final vegetable task that you need to be doing at the end of the spring season, whether it's cold weather crops, warm weather crops, or hot weather crops, is I want you to take the time to write down what went well, what didn't, and what you would do differently. Note which types and varieties did the best for you. How many pounds did you get of things? What was some of the timing that you want to do differently? Maybe you started something in September and you want to move it forward to August or push it back later till November. That is the time to really, especially with our vegetable garden, is to do a hard look at the whole season, your fall season, your winter season, and your spring season, because we have basically finished classic vegetable season. And the more we take the time to note what went well, what didn't, and what we would do differently, the better we're gonna restart in a couple of months. I know for me, year over year, this has been one of the best tips and tasks that I've done to make sure that when I'm getting ready for the next season, now I know it's working and I have a pretty good list of what I wanna do differently and how I wanna do it differently, so I don't have to refigure it out as I'm scrambling to order seeds and get seeds started. So take the time, whether it's in my planner or you do it in a notebook or somewhere, just take the time to make note of what went well, what didn't, and what you would do differently. Let's talk flowers and spring. Now here in Florida, while vegetable season always seems to be kind of a little topsy-turvy, flowers, while it might not be the same types of flowers that they grow up north, you can do flowers. I mean, we literally, our name, Florida, means land of flowers. You should be having tons and tons of flowers in your garden. And similar to what we kind of do with vegetable crops is we're also going to be getting into our warm season flowers and hot season flowers. At the beginning of the season, you can maybe still get away with putting some of those warmer weather transplants in. And then as we move throughout the season, you want to move more into hot flowers, hot transplant flowers. What does this mean? So we can think about things like sun patience or impatiens that are the Thai type. You can think about things like gaillardias, coneflowers, milkweeds, pentas, coreopsises, sages, and of course sunflowers. Native and Florida friendly. Now, if you are going to start things by seeds, I would be focusing more on those flowers that are going to really get going more in the summer months. So those are going to be kind of, I'll call them our hot weather flowers. And when it comes to native flowers, there's a lot of them. The typical cycle for laying down big wildflower beds, a lot of people tell you fall time, but in Florida, remember, we don't really have a snow that suppresses things. We just kind of have stuff going all the time. And what's going to start really getting in bloom at this time of year as we go from spring into summer is going to be things like our native cone flowers. That can be everything from black-eyed Susans, purple cone flowers, cut leaf cone flowers. Gosh, there's like a lot of them. Orange cone flower, all of those. Also things like our giant ironweeds will be going into bloom over the summertime or late springtime. Our narrow leaf yellow top, which I'm a big fan of. It's just like a big cloud of yellow. My favorites, which are coreopsises, which Coreopsis leavenworthii is my favorite, and I really just want to add like a whole bunch for the late spring, early summertime, so consider. Now, when it comes to doing transplants, we have even more options, because if you're going to do transplants, you can actually do what I would call kind of our early season wildflowers. That's everything from Stokes asters to blue-eyed grasses to our mist flowers. You can also do kind of some of the plants that just stick around all year, things like dune sunflower and tropical sage. Those just like go and go and go. It really doesn't matter what time of year it is, other than just like the coldest months of winter, which we're out of. So you don't need to worry about those ones. So you have a lot of options when it comes to native plants, and you also do when it comes to those Florida friendlies that you can just pick up at the store. Now, one of the ones that I would love for you guys to kind of swap out for the native one would be milkweed. Getting things like our pink swamp milkweed or our white aquatic milkweed, these do so well. And a lot of the native nurseries carry this one. Like, they just carry so much of it. And it's gonna be one of those ones you'll add it now, right now. And then it's gonna go into bloom. You're gonna have some really, the pink swamp milkweed, the Florida ecotype, is a pale pink that will really be in bloom come July. So getting it in the ground right now is really important so that we have it in time for those like really cute blooms. The other thing to be thinking about when it comes to flowers at this time of year is that if you do have some of your cool weathers and they're in like a pot, you may want to consider starting to shift them into shadier locations, because our sun's going to get quite intense, and you may be able to stretch them to go a little bit longer by just getting them some shade cloth or moving them into the shade. And the reason why is while Florida gets hotter, we don't actually get significantly hotter. Like, when you look at places up north, they go from having temperatures in their warm weathers versus their hot weathers. They're swinging from 70 degrees all the way up into sometimes the hundreds of degrees. And Florida, well, because we have so much water around, we kind of just like, we're 70s, 80s, and 90s. 70s, 80s, and 90s. I feel like that's it. We're like 70s, 80s, and 90s, all through spring, all through summer. I have relatives who have come down from Chicago, and they talk about, yeah, it can get just as humid up there, and it can get just as hot, if not hotter up there. But the difference is we just kind of like stay there for months and months and months on end. That's what they told me. And that's why just moving some stuff into the shade is sometimes some of the reason plants are getting stressed and dying as we head to late spring and into summertime is really not as much because of the temperature as it is because of the sun. Our sun is just like super intense here in Florida. It is basically a tropical sun. It's like this, it's just a smidge off from being technically tropical. So a lot of plants that can handle the heat all of a sudden just like croak on us more because of the sun than the temperatures. So just something to think about, that's like a key piece that a lot of people kind of miss when they are trying to make plants that work well for them in similar temperatures in other parts of the country, but all of a sudden are struggling here. Another thing is that if you're going to be getting into native plants, spring is actually one of the great times to get into those native wildflowers. And the reason I say that is, if you go to pick up native plants in the wintertime, they look like a whole lot of not much. But spring, when you actually start to go to the nurseries, you will tend to start to see some of them in bloom, so you can get kind of an idea. Though it's still a little bit tricky just because of the fact that native plants tend to put down really deep roots because they're planning on lasting for years. So they still might not look like a lot, but you might get a better idea of what they look like. And they typically are going to last you spring, summer, and fall at a minimum. And one of the best reasons to go head over to those native nurseries is because you want to get into butterfly garden. It's spring and it is the best time to start your butterfly garden. You can start it pretty much any time of year, but spring is one of the best because the butterflies are coming back. Whether they were dormant or they migrated, they're coming back. And I can tell you right here, as we are transitioning from winter to spring, the amount of butterflies has very rapidly increased. We went from just having a monarch here and there to we have tons of monarchs, Gulf fritillaries, orange bars. And as spring continues, we will start to see things like zebra longwings and giant swallowtails. And I think I saw a polydamas butterfly the other day. We have so many butterflies here in Florida. And if you are looking to get into butterfly gardening, you should really check out this video right here. It takes you through all the fundamentals and basics. But those tips, you will still walk away saying, what's the right time of year for me? And it's spring. Get them in spring. And one of the things, of course, you want to start with getting are host plants. And host plants, as much as I will try to give you options for the Home Depots, the Lowe's, the Targets, the Walmarts, the big box stores where you can pick up plants, typically you cannot buy host plants at those stores. You have to go to a native nursery. But the cool thing is most native nurseries have tons of host plants for you to pick up. Everything from corky stem passion vine to swamp milkweeds to aquatic milkweeds, to our native low-growing blue porterweed, privet senna, frog fruits, brown savories. I mean, the list can go on. There's a lot of native host plants that can bring in lots of different types of butterflies for you. So make sure if you want to get butterflies in, host plants is like the number one. That's like the trick to get them going and get them in here. Now, if you are going to get into native plants, one of the things that you may want to do, especially if you get host plants, is get some bug netting just to get them established. Because at this time of year, there are lots of butterflies that are going to be excited to come to your garden, but their little caterpillars just might eat the plant down to the base. So consider just getting a little bit of bug netting just to allow 2-4 weeks for those plants to get really well established, and then let the caterpillars just like have at it. The next thing you want to do in addition to those host plants is to add high nectar plants like these tropical sages. They are going to feed your butterflies once they have gone from caterpillar to butterfly, but they're also going to bring in tons and tons of bees. And I honestly, this is one of my favorites because, well, I told you Coreopsis earlier, but the thing is it only blooms for part of the year, and tropical sage, especially my flamingo pink, blooms almost the entire year for me. And I think it's a great addition to lots of people's gardens. So if you want to get some flamingo pink tropical sage in your life, you should. Beyond adding wildflowers for butterflies and bees, you may want to add some native plants so that you don't have to have an ugly looking lawn. I'm not saying grass doesn't look good, but at this time of year, because of the droughts, typically, well, your plants are stressed because they're trying to reach for water. So you may want to run your sprinklers more. But at the same time, because the aquifers are getting low, a lot of cities and counties start putting in water restrictions so you can't water as much. It's one of those catch-22s. So what to do if your lawn's starting to look well, is you may want to start considering converting your lawn to a native lawn alternative like sunshine mimosa. Lawn alternatives in general for Florida tend to use less water. They don't require fertilizers, and also they can just look really pretty. I'm a big fan of sunshine mimosa for some areas, but it is one of those tricky ones that can be a problem for those of you who have septic fields underneath, because they can actually reach down to your septic tanks. These ones, even though they're pretty low growing, only have roots that go 5 to 8 feet down, you know. But other ones like brown savory, dune sunflower, and things like frog fruit and water hyssop don't have roots that go that deep. They only go probably about a foot and a half deep, and then they're pretty cut off at that point. Now, if you want to learn way more about other lawn alternatives and kind of pros and cons and things to think about, you may want to check out this video right here. Go through the pros and the cons of each one, so that if you want to start thinking about converting your lawn, you could go ahead and think through what might work best for you. Now you may be wondering, what else should you be thinking about? We've hit lawns, we've talked flowers, we've talked veggies, but what else should we be thinking about? Well, one, we talked about the water being kind of low, so you may want to consider adding a rain gauge to your area just so you can have a better idea of how much water is actually hitting your garden beds, your lawn, and then that way you can make better choices if you're going to make any adjustments. Plus, if you're going to go add a little bit of extra water, maybe doing things more like spot treating, like just watering a bed instead of trying just to water everything as you go through drought season. The other thing to think about is especially things like your vegetables, even though we're kind of at the tail end. I mean, if you've been doing classic vegetable gardening with me all throughout the year, we're kind of, well, in the final quarter. So we may need to do another round of compost or just kind of like a top dressing of fertilizer just to help our crops finish out the classic season. The other thing to think about is because our sun intensity is increasing, not only some of your cool weather flowers, but your vegetables, depending on where you've placed your beds, may need some shade cloth to finish out the season too. Because Florida, kind of tricky when we talk about full sun, and a lot of people don't know that when they first start their vegetable beds, is oftentimes while the location was really, really good for the winter time, it's not so great as we head into spring or summer. So you may want to grab yourself some shade cloths and create like a little rig so that you can just give a little bit of shade for your crops, because it does get a bit hot and a bit sun intensity. Now, some of you guys have talked to me about that you have kind of more of those mobile, like you have like a green stalk, or you have pots that have like rollers and you can move them around. And this may be the time of year, not at the beginning of spring, but kind of more late spring, is you may be able to extend some of your crops by moving them into your screen lanai area. And this would be a great choice. I'm like a big fan. I love that so many of you have been asking me about this lately. And yes, take advantage of your natural shade cloth, which is your screen lanai. Typically, I wouldn't be doing this probably until like April or maybe early May. But the biggest thing is just watch your plants to see what kind of signals they're sending to kind of figure out what's best for your area. Another thing to consider doing at this time of year, as we're kind of getting into those drier months, is to extend how much water you have, and that would be by adding mulch. Whether you do like a wood chip mulch, or you take some of your grass clippings or other clippings and you just lay them in the beds, whether it's flower, fruit, or vegetable beds. This is gonna be a way we can kind of start to extend the moisture that we do have, instead of allowing it just to all evaporate or end up in our compost pile, or worse, in our trash. This will also be an additional benefit because it's heating up. Some plants are getting stressed, but some are liking the weather, and that's going to be, of course, our weeds. And they're definitely going to be trying to like sprout and take over some of our beds. So using this kind of as a double win can be a benefit to you. And last but not least, you have so many tasks, so many ideas of things you could be doing, plants you could be adding to your garden. The biggest thing you should be thinking about as we head into the spring season is don't just think about it, plan it, track it, and do it. And one of the ways that you can do that is by grabbing your Wild Floridian Garden Planner, which you can pick up at the link right here. And if you're looking for even more ideas and even more plants to get inspired by, or you're curious what that plant was behind me, go ahead and check out this spring tour where I go over 57 different plants that you could be having in your spring garden right here in Florida. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye.